Both sides are guilty of trying to intimidate the other. The Israelis, unfortunately, have the upper hand. They have the money, they have the capability to do that so effectively to a people that they have now imprisoned.
The following account is true. It is the story of Lynn Gross, a nurse currently living in San Diego, California. During March and April of 2002, Lynn volunteered to travel to Israel and Lebanon, where she planned to provide free medical help for sick Palestinian babies, train the medical staffs at the hospital she visited, and establish neonatal intensive care units. As she traveled from place to place during her 6-week journey, Lynn was stopped and searched by Israeli soldiers stationed at checkpoints along the way. At one of these checkpoints, a soldier asked her to explain why she wanted to help Palestinian children. But he did not wait for Lynn to answer. Instead, he answered for her. "This is not California," he told her. "This is not your war." Lynn did not agree. Instead, she made a promise to tell others about what she saw during those 6 weeks in Palestine. And this is her story. When we interviewed Lynn, she introduced herself and explained what she wanted to accomplish during her trip to Palestine. She also identified some of her concerns about the trip.
I'm Lynn Gross. I'm a traveling nurse in the Midwest of America. I went back to the Middle East. This was the 3rd time that I've been to the Middle East. And it was the 2nd time to go to the Middle East on refugee work. Over the U.S., I teach doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists. It was the 2nd trip for the PCRF. The 1st trip was to Lebanon, South Lebanon, and Sidon, to teach and to help a refugee hospital in Al-Hamshri refugee camp set up a neonatal intensive care unit. So the PCRF, or actually the Red Crescent Society in Lebanon, asked me to come back and do that again. And Steve from the PCRF said, "Would you be willing to go into Palestine this time?" And I said, "Sure. I've probably got 6 weeks this year to volunteer. Just send me where I would be the most useful." So, and we talked about the situation in Palestine on numerous occasions before I left, because Steve knows the area really well. I trust his judgment. He does really good work over there. But I wasn't sure how safe it was going to be. Every day that I looked at the news, it looked like it was getting worse. But Steve said to me, you know, it's going to be this way. These people still need your help. It's safe for humanitarian aid workers. And I also consulted with a friend of mine who's in the State Department, who said, you know, things are probably going to get worse, but you got a good head on your shoulders. Just go. I know you like to do this kind of stuff. So I went.
To understand Lynn's concerns about traveling in Palestine, it may help to trace the region's history and identify the sources of tension between today's Israeli government and the Palestinians. And that means stepping back in time nearly 1,400 years. Although it's now forgotten, from the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century A.D. until the middle of the 20th century, the area now known as Israel was the shared home of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. During most of that long period of time, the degree of religious toleration experienced throughout the Islamic world was unmatched in Western Europe, which was considered a primitive backwater by comparison. With some exceptions, the predominantly Islamic population considered members of all 3 faiths to be people of the book, sharing a common root in monotheistic Judaism. During World War I, in an effort to defeat the Turkish rulers of Palestine, Britain negotiated a series of separate and conflicting treaties with France, Russia, and European Zionists who were seeking a homeland for the Jews. In addition, the British negotiated a treaty with the Palestinian Arabs who were promised their own independent state in exchange for rebelling against the Turks. These incompatible agreements and the betrayal of the Palestinians are the source of today's problems. After World War I, and as a result of the tragic Holocaust in Europe during World War II, the rate of Jewish settlement in Palestine increased, and conflicts broke out between Palestinians and the Jewish settlers. In effect, the Europeans, who had been unable to resolve racism and strife within the borders of Europe, had exported their conflict to Palestine. This took place with the consent of the international community, including the United States. It is important to note that after the discovery of oil in the Middle East during the 1920s and 30s, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union each took a keen interest in the region. During the Cold War years and its aftermath, these nations took an active role in orchestrating political developments there, intervening openly, secretly, and frequently in the internal political struggles taking place throughout the Middle East. In Palestine, the British ruled openly until May of 1948. When their troops departed, a full-scale war broke out. When the conflict ended, the Jewish settlers had taken control of what is now known as the State of Israel. The remainder of Palestine was divided among Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, governments that were not concerned with the plight of the Palestinians. Israel now controls both the original territory gained in 1948 and areas that were occupied during the Six-Day War in 1967, namely the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Within the original pre-1967 territory, Israel is an apartheid state divided by religion. Within this territory, all citizens must carry cards that identify them as Jew, Muslim, or Christian. Non-Jews are second-class citizens and are subject to more than 20 discriminatory laws. These laws define different levels of land ownership rights, access to private and public employment, the availability of loans and mortgages, and access to a university education. There also are vast disparities in public spending for schools, health care, roads, electricity, clean water, and social services between Jews and non-Jews. Not surprisingly, unemployment and poverty among Palestinians are much higher than in the Jewish population. In the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Israeli administration resembles that of a prison camp. The Palestinians live in a crowded, closely controlled environment surrounded by barriers patrolled continuously by Israeli troops. They are subject to frequent shelling or bombing from F-16 jets supplied by the United States. Access is tightly controlled at checkpoints where Palestinians are herded into giant holding pens where they wait for hours in long lines, subject to searches, threats, and gunfire by Israeli guards before being allowed to pass from one area into another, whether simply going to work, visiting friends, or family members. In close proximity to these Palestinian zones, often perched atop nearby hills, are brand new Israeli settlements guarded by modern weapons purchased for the Israelis by the U.S. government. These conditions have existed in one form or another for more than 50 years. But at the time of Lynn Gross's visit, she was particularly concerned about rising tensions and outbreaks of violence. For example, there'd been a series of attacks on Palestinian residential and business districts, including the destruction by tanks, bombs, and helicopters of airports, neighborhoods, fishing boats, broadcasting facilities, and state-sponsored assassinations. Similarly, there had been Palestinian sniping incidents and a rash of suicide bombings. Lynn arrived in Jerusalem on March 9th, and we will trace her journey to Gaza, her return to Jerusalem, and arrival in Bethlehem.